Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. How are you, Tim?
I am great. How are you?
Fine, thank you. So our listeners know that if they were here last week, Tim and I had discussed the legislation and the ballot initiative aimed at reforming Prop 47. That's the 2014 ballot initiative that basically downgraded many felonies into misdemeanors, including drug possession and theft. So, folks, there's no going around it. The rampant organized theft and increased drug use has got to be attributable to Prop 47. But of course, Democrats won't say it because they don't want to turn off the progressives that now dominate their party. So the Dems in the legislature favor their own set of bills and want the ballot initiative to basically go away. So they're now in the midst of negotiating to have the initiative withdrawn and the legislation to move forward. But the Republicans mostly favor the bills and the initiative to go forward. And I got to say, after reading the media coverage, watching it over the weekend, mainstream media, Tim, seems to be favoring both approaches simultaneously. So what are you seeing?
Well, that's exactly right. You don't have to pick one or the other. And they're choosing to make it a thing because they are desperate for this Prop 47 measure to not make it on the ballot for whatever reason. Obviously, because they're left-wing base, for whatever reason, Prop 47 has become a religion to them. And even, these laws have been on the books for nearly a decade now. And, it's pretty much, they would say a quote unquote unintended consequence of the initiative drafting. I actually don't believe it was an unintended consequence of the initiative backers. I think they wanted it to be this way. I think they knew full well how it would be. And so if they can't succeed in getting it knocked off the ballot, well, then they want to divide and conquer. And they're doing all of this about, trying to put these poison pills in the retail bills so that they would be wiped off the books if the Prop 47 measure passes. They are not in conflict at all. And then if they can't succeed in doing that, well, if you put these poison pills in there, well, then in the title and summary that the Attorney General writes for every initiative, it'll say in the description, this measure would repeal 14 bills passed by the legislature to deal with retail theft. Well, when you have to go to those lengths, it really stinks. And it really shows they're trying to pull the wool over the eyes of voters and flex their muscles to go around or to try and stop what they haven't done, which is to fix the problems that have popped up since Prop 47 took effect. So it's been interesting to see the media shine the light from Ashley Zavala from KCRA3 to very negative editorials in the Chronicle and in the Sacramento Bee, and this morning George Skelton in the LA Times. And they're all saying, everybody agrees. You can have all your studies you want and your data, and our Steve Smith has debunked these at our blog and right by the Bay, including a piece he has up this morning. Numbers notwithstanding, people see it with their eyes every day. And so if the legislators aren't going to fix this issue, the people are. And even though it's a tough thing to do, this is the most favorable environment to pass these long overdue Prop 47 reforms. It was stunning last week. The Democrats had a press conference and Ashley Zavala kept asking them, well, what are the conflicts between these measures? They couldn't name them. When they came back a few days later, they admitted, well, maybe 5 might have a bit of a conflict. Well, they don't really, and you actually can work around those things. I think they've just been exposed as we're using our power to try and thwart the will of the people even before they have a chance to vote on it. And I think deep down, whether you agree with the measure or not, a lot of fair-minded people will say that's wrong and it rubs them the wrong way. And so we'll see what happens this week, whether they power through and just say, we don't care about the bad press. We're going to do what we're going to do and hope low information voters are fooled enough to vote no on this initiative. They really look bad here.
Well, Tim, last week, I think when we talked, I wasn't so optimistic, but no, I am, given the fact that the media has given some fair coverage of it. So I think that they'll both go forward.
That's what I would do, right? Why would you cower to them? You know, the only thing you have to worry about is if you have this divide and conquer, are you going to lose the financial support of the retailers? Who knows? You might. That's the thing. It costs a lot of money to put a measure on the ballot, costs a lot of money to pass it. So we'll see, on that. But I agree. You went to all this effort. Go for it.
To be determined. We'll see what happens. So we're going to do one more plug for our dinner in Napa with Victor Davis Hanson. It's next week. We still have a few tickets left. This was really a hot ticket, I must say. Our dinner is next Tuesday at the Meritage Resort in Napa, and you can purchase your tickets on our website at pacificresearch.org. Also, as an added bonus for the reception, we have guest Fritz Maytag, and many Bay Area residents know that Fritz was a former owner of the Ankerstein beer, and he's also a grower in Napa, and he's going to brief us about the issues happening in the valley, from water to wildfires and, of course, winemaking. So we'd love to have you attend. And let me just introduce our next guest. This week we have a special guest. It's Charles Kesler, one of the nation's most prominent political philosophers and editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and husband to our president, Sally Pipes. So his former students have produced a book celebrating the work of Professor Kesler. The book is called Leisure with Dignity, and we'll let him explain the title. So here's the great Professor Charles Kesler.
Join PRI on Saturday, September 21st at the Four Seasons Hotel Silicon Valley in East Palo Alto for our annual Sir Anthony Fisher Dinner, featuring this year's keynote speaker and Toby Family Freedom Prize recipient, Kimberly Strassel. You read her Potomac Watch column every week in the Wall Street Journal. You see her on TV in her regular appearances on Fox News Channel. And you read her best-selling books like The Biden Malaise. Now, come see her in person at a terrific evening supporting PRI. She'll discuss the 2024 election, what's going on in our nation's capital today, and the fundamental importance of civil liberties. Visit pacificresearch.org/events today to buy your tickets. While you're there, you can learn about sponsorship opportunities. We hope to see you on Saturday, September 21st. Tickets are selling fast, so visit pacificresearch.org/events today to secure your spot.
Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast, Professor Kesler.
Thank you, Rowena. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So you publish books from time to time, but this time there's actually a book just published about you, Leisure with Dignity, Essays in Celebration of Charles Kesler, published by your former students. So there's an explanation of the title in the introduction of the book. So how about explaining it to our listeners? Why Leisure with Dignity?
Well, it's an English translation of a Latin phrase that Cicero uses in maybe a couple of his writings. In Latin, it's cum dignitate otium, so leisure with dignity. But it's a phrase that means essentially the liberal arts. What do you do if you're a free person with all of your leisure and your resources? How do you spend your life with dignity, and yet not being a slave, not doing hard labor that a lot of people, of course, still have to do in the world? It's a great privilege to be in the liberal arts. And when you're in the liberal arts, reading, writing, teaching, you are spending your leisure with dignity. And that's what the phrase really means. That is, it's a nice, I think, alternative to the ivory tower, let's say, as a way of describing the academic life and the academic world. The ivory tower suggests it's, above ordinary things. It's high, it's a tower, and it's ivory, so it's not really all that useful. It's brilliant, it's beautiful. But leisure with dignity, I think, is more open-ended, and it suggests the variety of things one can do with leisure and with learning that are useful to yourself and to your friends, and if you're lucky, to your country.
So the first essay in the book on first looking into Plato's law is written by Bradley Watson. And for our listeners who may not be familiar with him, he now teaches at Hillsdale's Washington campus. And he writes in the book, quote, if we know why and how a society punishes, i.e., what constitutes deviance and its control, we know much about the character of that society. So, of course, that got us to thinking about all the rising crime in the streets of our major cities, and certainly, especially in here in California, right outside PRI's office doors, and, with seemingly little consequence for the perpetrators of those crimes. What does that say about our society, Charles?
Well, it's possible to punish too little as well as punishing too much, and both are mistakes. Both are, in a way, failures to love your fellow citizens as you, as you should. Not holding people responsible for the crimes they commit, the costs they impose on their neighbors and on the society around them, not holding them to account for that is a way of treating them as children, infantilizing them, not acknowledging that they are capable of governing themselves or of misgoverning themselves. If you treat your fellow citizens as though they matter, as though they care, as though they're your equal in their ability to deliberate about what the society should do and to take part in society's rituals, then you have to be prepared to punish them when they fail to meet those standards. And not doing so is an insult to them, even though it might be a welcome insult for the perpetrators.
Charles, another essay is by Tim Caspar, the deputy editor of Imprimis. His chapter is on the Roman politician Cicero. He writes that Cicero was not only a statesman, but a teacher of statesmen. So you're an expert on Cicero. Tim Caspar cites an analogy that Cicero often used: quarreling sailors who represent, quote, the statesmen now ruling and who care only about the struggle for political power, but lack the knowledge required for just rule. Cicero casts himself as one of the true pilots whose knowledge is essential for bringing the ship of state safely into port. So, surveying today's politicians, does anyone rise to the task? Care to mention any politicians?
Well, that's a tough question in both of its dimensions. So first of all, the analogy that Cicero uses it comes essentially from Plato and from the tradition. What is the difference between someone who is an artist, who knows how to make a chair or to make a great meal? What's the difference between someone who has knowledge of justice and could rule a society, well and humanely, and those who don't, those who have fake knowledge or incomplete knowledge, and who would fail carpentry or cookery, for that matter, and in the much more important art of politics, really don't know what is right, what is good for their country, or how to produce what is good for their country. And these people are like the quarreling sailors on a misruled ship who don't know anything about the art of sailing, but have plenty of opinions about how the ship should be managed and where they should be going. Whereas the pilot, if there is such a thing as an art of ruling or a political art, then the true pilot would be the person who possesses that art. Whether he's the official pilot or not, he may be a mere sailor, he may be a passenger, but if he actually knows how to sail, the point is he should be the pilot. He's the only one. The person who knows is the person who ought to be responsible for the exercise of the art or science that we're talking about. And it is often the case, of course, as Cicero well knew, that the people who would do a good job as, let's say, consul of Rome or president of the United States never live a life that sets them up to be considered for those jobs. And so they may have all this knowledge, but it doesn't do them any good. And it may not do their country or their city any good either. So political philosophy in the oldest sense, in the ancient sense, is about how to make those two things coincide, how to bring the art of ruling together with the office that would allow you to rule. Philosophers have to become kings, or kings have to become philosophers, to use Plato's famous formulation in the Republic, before you have a reliable chance of having a good city with good citizens in it. And so that's what Tim Kaspar is getting at there. Now, in America, to come to the second part of your question, let's face it, when you have a presidential race between that's a rerun of 2020, you don't seem to, as Donald Trump himself might say, they don't seem to have sent their best to compete for this job, this very important job. Nonetheless, in the way our party system has evolved, these seem to be the two nominees who are coming forward. And unless you want to vote for Robert Kennedy Jr., this is the choice that citizens are going to face. Both of them have been president. Joe Biden is still president. So we have a record on which to judge them, by which to judge them. Considering that, it's a tough choice, I think, for a lot of people who are put off by both candidates, who have some obvious weaknesses and difficulties. But, if when you try to get better candidates, you immediately run into a problem. First of all, Trump is sort of sui generis, and there's no obvious successor to him, no obvious even compliment for him. And Joe Biden is hard to replace too. Joe Biden is actually very well liked in the Democratic Party. You wouldn't know that from the anti-Israel, pro-Palestine demonstrations going on around the campuses these days. But it remains true. He polls very well among the Democratic electorate. But of course, popularity and competence are not necessarily the same thing, as we were just saying. So I like politicians who may not be so popular, but who seem to me to know what they're doing. I would mention my old friend and another old student of mine, Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, who served honorably in the army in Afghanistan and Iraq. At this moment, when national security issues are crawling back onto the agenda or bounding back onto the agenda, he is one of the few possible candidates, I think, for vice president, or if he's not in a position to be president this time, who it seems to me might actually unite competence and knowledge with office. So I'll mention him. I'll mention him as a good example.
Glenn Elmers, who's the Salvatore Research Fellow at the Claremont Institute and one of the editors of the book, writes on Shakespeare, specifically King Lear. So this naturally got us to thinking, and coincidentally for our listeners, this could be a good conversation starter at your next cocktail party. Among Shakespeare's plays, who is your favorite politician and why?
Well, that's a good question, but a hard question. Most of the rulers in Shakespeare are not very good at ruling. Some of them are tyrants, of course. Some of them are murderers. More than a few, in fact, are murderers. To find a good ruler in Shakespeare is not impossible, but it isn't that easy. And I'm an especial fan of the Roman plays because I did write my dissertation many years ago on Cicero, and I have followed things Roman for a long time in my own academic career. So I know something about it. And Shakespeare knows a lot and has a lot to teach us about Rome. You know, he has 3 Roman plays. He's got he's got Coriolanus, first of all, and then Julius Caesar, and then Antony and Cleopatra. They're quite different plays, and they look at Rome at different periods and facing different problems. Of the 3, my favorite is, I think, Julius Caesar. And Caesar, there are at least two interesting characters in Julius Caesar that would repay attention. My favorite, of course, is Cicero, my man, who has only a small role in the play. He was not historically part of the conspiracy against Caesar. They didn't, and the conspirators, Brutus, Cassius, and so forth, didn't invite him into the conspiracy. And so he didn't know about it ahead of time. And so he doesn't have a dramatic role really in the play. But nonetheless, his speeches, which are few, are quite interesting. And he sees, for example, the problems, the weaknesses of someone like Brutus, who is going to, have it in his hands to replace Caesar with the Republic again, a real Republican regime in which people like himself and Cassius and others would become consul, would be ruling in that new Republic. But and he blows it for reasons that are not simply accidental, or at least I think that's what Shakespeare is trying to show us, because Cicero remarks on this in passing that, Brutus is a Stoic. And so he spends no time really thinking about rhetoric or about how a philosopher ought to appeal to non-philosophers, to ordinary people who are, of course, the vast majority of people in any city, in any country, who are involved in politics necessarily. And therefore, the philosopher's ways are not the ways of the city, not the ways of politics. And the philosopher has to speak not as a philosopher, but as a citizen and as a politician. And Brutus doesn't really know how to do that. And his biggest mistake is, of course, leaving the meeting being held over Caesar's dead body and allowing Mark Antony to give the funeral oration, which is the beginning of the end of the Republican cause in Rome and the beginning of basically the first step towards the new imperial Rome, which Mark Antony and Octavius will bring in to being. So that's why, for me, that play. The other part of that play, I mentioned there are 2 great characters in it. Well, one great character that I mentioned was Caesar. The other one is a minor character, but I think he repays interest. And Cicero himself is in a terrible position in the play and in history. He was a friend of Caesar's. Caesar had pardoned him because he had been a part of the revolt against Caesar early on. And Caesar, of course, was a writer. He's a literary man, not just a general and a politician. And the 2 had something in common that underlay their friendship. So he was left out of the conspiracy, probably because he was regarded as not entirely trustworthy by the conspirators. That's a tough position to be in, not able to advise Caesar, nor being trusted to kill him. It's a tough position. But Caesar, as depicted by Shakespeare, is just as elusive and hard to read as the historical figure really was. I think it's very unclear what Caesar is up to, and whether he intends to become an emperor and a god in the play, or whether he is, just a very good politician trying to do the best he can in a difficult situation for the Roman city. He's not just a politician, of course. He's head and shoulders above all the others. But is he a tyrant or a would-be tyrant, or is he a benevolent despot of some kind? Is that what he's trying to be? It's a hard question to answer, but Shakespeare shows you why it's a hard question to answer.
So now Matt Spalding is now the Kirby Professor in Constitutional Government of Hillsdale College. In his essay, he writes about the founders and classical prudence. Prudence, Matt writes, is the virtue that has to do with deliberation, judgment, and decision based on experience and the knowledge of particulars. So Matt laments the destruction of prudence in political life today. Would you agree?
That's a good question. And yes, I would agree. I mean, prudence has certainly been dethroned in political science, if that's the side of politics you're talking about. Political science has grown increasingly sciencey, increasingly scientific, sort of on a poor model of natural sciences, and therefore mathematical equations and formal models are not exactly the rage in political science, but they're still very popular and help to define how a lot of people in the United States think of politics and study politics. Not history, not the actual confrontation with political circumstances and decisions that citizens and statesmen alike have to confront. That's the old-fashioned political science of the founders, of Winston Churchill, say, of Abraham Lincoln, and of the ancients. And prudence as practical wisdom is sort of the highest theme of classical political science, and it's a very important theme in American political science properly understood. For example, you can't really understand American politics, it seems to me, unless you understand at least two men in our history, and that's George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, the two greatest presidents by common consent, and also two supremely practically wise men for whom circumstances matter profoundly. Timing is everything. You know, if you think of all the hard decisions that Lincoln faced, where he couldn't make them until the moment was ripe. And he was from the very beginning of the Civil War, he maneuvered so that the South would have to fire the first shots. And that was his prudence at work. I mean, there might have been some military advantage to striking first if you were the Union Army, but there was no political advantage in it. And making them, the other side, be the aggressor was a wonderful beginning of the war from his point of view. It was not a war of northern aggression, despite what the South sometimes says about it and has always said about it. And those kinds of decisions that you have to make in the press of events and in the crucible of changing circumstances, that's where prudence shows itself and where prudence reigns supreme, I would say. Matt Spalding has done a lot of very good work on George Washington, and so he's well qualified to make this point about the lamented disappearance of prudence.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know. So leave it to Michael Anton, who served on President Trump's national security staff and now is a lecturer at Hillsdale College and is a past Next Round podcast guest. Leave it to him to challenge you in his essay, The Federalist and the Ancients. Now, you're an expert on the Federalist Papers, of course, and Michael Anton writes, "To be blunt, these days I find the Federalist to be, in the words of my fellow Kesler student Glenn Elmers, the owner's manual for a car that no longer runs." Well, it's time for some equal time here. Perhaps, Charles, you would like to straighten out your students here?
Yes, I would. Well, I think first of all, it's a marvelous phrase that Glenn has come up with, the owner's manual for a car that no longer runs. But I tip my hat to him for that phrase and for the analysis. I mean, Michael and Glenn are very important parts, you might say, of the new right, the sort of the youthful critics of the old right of Bill Buckley and Ronald Reagan, or at least of the successors, let's say, of Bill Buckley and Ronald Reagan. And many of their criticisms, it seemed to me, hit home. So there's a lot to be learned from both of them. And they happen to be the co-editors of this book, Leisure with Dignity, to whom I owe a great deal of thanks, of course. And I'm delighted by the book. And it was a complete surprise to me, by the way, when it was unveiled. So they not only are they smart and honorable, they're stealthy. and those are all good qualities for people who are in government or talking about government. But I don't think we're quite at the point where the car doesn't start anymore. I think the Constitution is not in good shape. I would admit that. There's been a lot of bad Supreme Court decisions in the last 50 years, and even before that. But worse than that, even very bad decisions by presidents and Congress that have reduced the importance of the Constitution and the power of the Constitution. The fidelity that Americans used to show to the Constitution is, I think, weakening. All that's true, but it seems to me that all of those facts, once admitted, amount to a case for bringing the Constitution back into health, bringing it back from the brink of disappearing. And so all of those things, for me at least, amount to reasons why we should redouble our efforts to live as a constitutional society and as a constitutional republic. And that means taking on the political science establishment, the liberal establishment, and certainly I would agree it means taking on certain aspects, at least, of the conservative establishment too. But I don't think that there's really an alternative to attempting to revive and rehabilitate and reinvigorate the Constitution. The attempt to go post-constitutional, to find some new form of political order is fraught with difficulties. First of all, because most of the efforts to find a post-constitutional form of government end up being strangely pre-constitutional. So you have a lot of young people on the right who talk about Caesars, red Caesar, blue Caesar, the need for a strong leader to bring clarity and purpose and morality back to American politics. I understand the diagnosis, but I don't think that the prescription would ever really fit that diagnosis. I don't think that Caesar is not on hand in our politics of any sort. And Caesar is himself, only one person and is untrustworthy. He's fallible like everybody else. And I don't think he has the kind of support in our society that he would have had and did have in the ancient Rome. Americans still are patriotic. They love their country. They love the country of Washington and Lincoln. And even though that country is not very loved in popular media or in the news media, or in classrooms these days, it still exerts, I think, a profound emotional and political and rational appeal once its glories are reintroduced to students and to citizens. And that's something that I've tried to do in my own career, and that I'm sure Glenn and Anton and the other contributors to this volume, this excellent volume, will try to do in their lives and have tried and are trying to do in their lives. It's an uphill struggle, but that's no reason to shun it.
So now let's turn to America's role in the world. In an essay by Anthony Peacock, now a professor at Utah State, his essay is called The Federalist on Enterprise, War, and Empire. Today, both the right and the left and many in between are weary of war and weary of globalism. Nevertheless, there are forces that seek to dominate the world, or at least their neighbors, talking about China and Russia and Iran here. Are there lessons from the framers that can guide us through these turbulent times?
Well, this is an easy question to answer. Yes, there are plenty of lessons from the framers, not only their writings, but their lives, their experience in office, especially George Washington's. And he warns against. It's useful to go back to something even as familiar as, say, Washington's farewell address. There, he warns us against having permanent friendships. And so, if you think about our situation in NATO vis-a-vis Ukraine and Russia, NATO is probably among the oldest, longest-lasting alliances in human history. But it doesn't mean it can last forever or should last forever. It only should last as long as it makes sense from the point of view of America, and that's what Washington is saying. You can't afford in international politics, you can't afford having permanent friends and enemies. The national interest has to be, conceptualized and figured out in every situation anew. The formulas of the past may be inadequate to the necessities of the present. And so Washington, took a position of neutrality during the great wars of Napoleon, for and against Napoleon in Europe and against France, and the wars of the French Revolution, broadly speaking. America was too weak to pick a side and to exert itself in those wars. It was in our interest to stay out of those wars, even though the French under the king had been our ally against the British in the American Revolution. And so Jefferson, Madison, and people, you might say, on the left of our politics in those days were very keen to have us come to France's rescue in the post-French Revolutionary period, in the period of the great wars against England. Washington kept us out of those, and his successor, Adams, also kept us out of those very adroitly. by some serious diplomacy and some building of the American military capacity to make us a little more formidable, especially the Navy, a little more formidable to our old friends and enemies. As far as NATO goes now, it does have, it seems to me, a continuing utility, even if it is not as necessary as it once was. It may be necessary again, and certainly allowing Russia, for example, to run rampant over Eastern Europe and Central Europe and Western Europe is not exactly in the U.S. national interest. So I think Washington would say, with the new right, NATO has to be rethought. It has to be, we have to be sure that the other countries are contributing what they should be contributing, and that it is truly in our interest as well as in theirs, the decisions that the alliance makes. But that's not a reason to abandon it naively or because we're bored with it or tired of it or we're tired of war. One of the great lessons of the Federalist Papers is there is no end of war. War is a permanent phenomenon of politics. That's to be regretted, but it can't be abolished. You have to prepare for war. You have to be serious about war, even as you try to avoid it and to steer a peaceful path forward. And that kind of national interest with justice, diplomacy, and strategy is what I think the founders would recommend to us in our present circumstances. Not really too far from how President Reagan thought about international politics and particularly the Soviet Union, back in the 1980s. That too seems to me a very prudent geostrategy that he developed, that we were prepared to help free peoples fighting for their freedom against the Soviet Empire, but we didn't do it by sending in our troops or by conducting a general war between the Soviet Empire and the United States. We did it by working with peoples who wanted to be free of the Soviet Union, whether the Polish people or Hungarians or others in those days. And that sort of moderate path proved to be very successful as well.
We'll get back to our terrific interview in just a moment, but first, PRI's YouTube channel is must-watch. By visiting youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, you can watch webinars, videos, and other original content, including our new Free City Center video tours and interviews. You can watch as PRI's Wayne Weingarten tours Dignity Moves, a San Francisco nonprofit that is reimagining scalable solutions to homelessness with founder and CEO Elizabeth Funk. And you can check out Stephen Greenhut's tour of a proposed new city in rural Solano County that has generated significant interest and intrigue. You can even listen to previous episodes of Next Round Podcast. So visit PRI's YouTube channel today at youtube.com/Pacific Research 1, that's the number 1, and click the subscribe button to receive notifications about our latest content as soon as it's posted. Philip Munoz, who's a professor at Notre Dame, quotes John Adams in his essay, Defending American Natural Rights Republicanism. And he writes that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people, says Adams. If Americans are no longer up to the task of being both moral and religious, he says, the fault lies primarily with us, not our founding principles, as the left would counter. So, question to you, Charles, would you agree with Philip Munoz?
This is a famous saying of John Adams. It's true. The Constitution, all of our machinery of American politics presupposes a people that in some fundamental way moral and religious. Those two things are very close to one another, morality and religion, since religion is usually the primary teacher of morality to most people in most countries. They're not exactly the same. I mean, morality can be defended on reasonable or rational grounds, and not simply on revealed or scriptural grounds. So there's a distinction between them. But George Washington, to return to his farewell address, advises that morality and religion both be preserved and enhanced in America and by American politics. So Adams, who of course was eventually his vice president, is on to this. That saying of Adams is both a call to action and a warning against the wrong kind of action. Morality and religion are presupposed by our institutions, but how does if they have decayed, if morality and religion are not what they used to be, what do you do about them? That's a slightly different question that Adams is not engaged in answering in that famous quotation, which is, I think, from either a letter of his or a speech of his later in his life. But for us, I think a lot of people have the sense that American morals are not as good as they used to be, and American religion it certainly seems to be not as strong as it once was, at least as measured by the number of people filling the pews on any given Sunday or Saturday, depending on your religion, your faith. Nonetheless, Phil Munoz, who's an expert on the First Amendment, meaning the both clauses that have to do with religion, the free exercise of religion clause and the no establishment clause. If Phil were here, he would certainly tell you that there are ways that government can be friendly to religion in a kind of non-sectarian way, and that those approaches are newly popular because people do want to do something, do want to have a kind of restored or bolstered religious influence in our society, and thus serving the common good of morality for the whole society through religion as a means, you might say. And we can see this today in how educational choice, for example, has been a popular cause for religious schools and religious congregations to embrace. And there's a kind of wave of new schools, K through 12 schools, being founded across the country, some of which are called classical liberal arts schools, others of which are frankly religious schools, but taking a sort of classical approach to the curriculum. And this ought to be, I think, acknowledged as a kind of renaissance of American education. It has little to do with public schools, although it has something to do with some charter schools that are public schools. But I think it shows you that the American people are not content with the status quo, and that they think improvement is possible, and that morality and religion, which are not in their best shape, can nonetheless be resuscitated. And the wonderful thing about education, is that students begin with very little knowledge, but able to learn. And so you can start again. With every generation, you have the possibility of teaching reason and revelation to an audience that hasn't yet been spoiled, as maybe the older American audience has been to some extent.
Steve Hayward is a PRI fellow and currently a visiting professor at Pepperdine School of Public Policy. So in his essay, he discusses the rise of the administrative state under progressivism. So Hayek, who is fondly remembered here at PRI, argued that bureaucratic experts will never know enough to get it right. But everywhere, especially here in California, you see the power of government encroachment and the nanny state. And yet, many citizens still vote for these politicians who want big government. So do you think Americans have gone soft? Do they want to leave it to these so-called experts at the expense of their own freedom? And how did this all come about?
Steve Hayward is right. Two things are true about American government. One is that it has gotten bigger and bigger and more expert-driven, more bureaucratic as it has grown bigger. That's true. It's also true that the bigger the government has gotten, the less respect, the less affection is felt for it by the people. And so those two trends, you would think, are on a kind of collision course. At some point, the people who vote for the politicians who vote for bigger government, let's say broadly speaking, would realize what they are doing and that the results of these votes they don't like. They don't like having the COVID-19 pandemic handled by federal health bureaucrats or by state level health bureaucrats. These were issues that a robust political debate should have broken out about and should have determined. Where were the legislatures? Where was Congress? Where were the state legislatures? Why weren't they reining in their governors and their public health bureaucracy? It's a good question. And we can't, unfortunately, go back in time and replay that history. But we can only go forward. I think a lot of lessons became clear and were learned in the course of the reaction to the pandemic. Exaggerated both the amount of rational or bureaucratic control that governments can exert top down on a free society like this. And they didn't exaggerate. They did exaggerate the threat as well, although sometimes they spoke the truth as they knew it. But the experts don't know as much as they claim to know. And that's a very basic lesson that Hayek could have taught us a long time ago. The problem of knowledge in a free society can't be solved bureaucratically. It can be solved by market mechanisms and by the kind of political intelligence that is open to the distributed nature of knowledge in a complex modern society. And fortunately, the present bureaucratic state is the result of over 100 years of political revolution in the country, a slow motion revolution, but one that began in the progressive period at the beginning of the 20th century. So that's over 100 years ago. And a state that has grown as prodigiously as ours has in 100 years probably is not going to be disciplined, much less dismantled in the course of a single presidential term. It's a long-term problem that requires a long-term solution. But, the long term begins now. And so the arguments against the Hayekian and other kinds of arguments against bureaucracy and the administrative state are finding, I think, a growing audience in our time, and that gives us some hope for future times.
So let's end on an optimistic note. In The Messiah of the Machiavellian Moment, Murray Bassett, formerly the vice president of the Common Sense Society, writes about the good and wise man who's trying to reform a corrupt state, but because fortune may prevent him from acting, what is the good man to do? Well, we may feel a little like that in California and in the nation these days. Machiavelli says in this situation, it's the duty of a good man to teach others the good that you could not work, so that when many are capable of it, some one of them more loved by heaven may be able to work it. So, Charles, what are your thoughts on Machiavelli here?
This is a good piece of advice, whether it comes from Machiavelli or from Aristotle, I think. Machiavelli, though, has a way of writing around the edges of his good advice and bringing out unhappy truths that he has a kind of perverse enjoyment in pointing out. That's what makes him a Machiavellian, even though he's the original. I would say that, yes, teaching, I'm happy to have spent my life as a teacher. at Harvard and at Claremont McKenna College for these past 4 decades. It is a marvelous life of leisure with dignity, but it also allows you to stay connected with young people and with the problems of our society as they have deepened and mutated over the course of those decades. And yes, I think, there's no substitute for that combination of political consciousness, political knowledge, political skill, with the moral disposition to do better and to make society better, healthier, and more sound.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.